يا لغتي عربية حسبي بأنك منطقي وبياني عربية قلبي.
Hello.
Can you get just a little bit closer to each other? That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Go on. Become a Christian.
Become a Christian.
What are you waiting for?
I don't know, convince me if you could, or if you may, as in what is there for me to leave Islam, wherein I believe in a monotheistic God, in purity, in a monolithic one concept of a God. Why would I leave that? What would be persuasive for me to leave that to go to Christianity, which professes a Trinity, which is a difficult thing to swallow because of the mysterious nature that surrounds it. Because I don't believe, if a concept is mysterious, how then will you proselytize it to people if you haven't fully grasped it yourself?
Okay, so are you saying the idea of a Trinity that holds you back from becoming a Christian?
Not so much so.
Or
I
is there
have a
something
series of things that, that really is of concern. The main thing I like to look at is probably a historical kind of analysis where the text came from.
Yeah.
Where the text came from. Is this text suitable? Has it got eyewitnesses? Does it have sources, references? Who wrote it? When was it written? The audience? And so on.
Yeah, okay, I can't really, well, I can say a little bit about the history of the New Testament, basically. I suppose that's most of what you're talking about. But there's historic research that you can do, and you can find out who wrote what, when and where. There's lots of scholars are debating about that. But if we can assume that the bigger picture of what we read in the Bible is more or less what we have agreed on, that's what it is. Then we can talk about what we have written, sort of in the Bible that you have in your hand, and sort of clarify things that you find difficult. Because I would say there is, it is, you can say, we don't know who wrote it. I would say most of the books we do know who wrote it. We can go back quite a long way to the first books or book fragments and all that, to the time of the New Testament, sort of the turn of the century. The Old Testament, we can go back to even before that. You know, it's translated by the Jews into Greek before Jesus came. So we can go back a long way with most things. So we can sort of take at least the bigger picture. You could argue about a word here or there, but in the bigger picture I would say the Bible is a reliable source of information. Okay? That doesn't mean you understand it all, and it doesn't mean I understand it all, or that we agree with everything, but it's one of the most reliable books that we have from that time, you know, that we have original, well, fairly original or very close to the source of information. So I would say in general you can say it's a fairly reliable source of information. And it tells us about a story about God, how God made the world, how God interfered with the world, you know, how people are looking for God, etc. So it's really a story about God and people. It's not just about history or about biology or things like that, it's about God, okay? It's quite a long story of lots of stories of various people who are finding how God speaks to them. So in that sense, if you're looking for God, it's a very interesting book because...
No, it's definitely 100% interesting. I think everyone generally agrees that, you know, it's one of the most read books in the world. But from a historical perspective, as in perhaps we could scrutinize it a bit more, when we're being parsimonious about it, certain questions arise in terms of the reliability of the text. We were speaking not long ago about the quoting that you find in Matthew.
Yeah.
Whenever Matthew quotes the Old Testament, it seems that he keeps on getting it wrong. Should we bring examples, or should we just go with it? As in, you're aware of these quotes. You usually find it that Matthew, he's talking about the Old Testament, and there's usually a letter in the Bible. If you just go to the footnote, it refers you to the Old Testament. Now, every time it does so, the wording is not the same. Thematically, it may be, as in the idea is still carried on. But it seems that every time Matthew is saying, have you not read, or when it's quoting Jesus of having said that, it gets it wrong. So how then can we trust this Bible to be preserved in terms of its theology?
It's an important point, because one of the reasons why I say the Bible is reliable, because of the consistency with between the different books, like the consistency between even things in Genesis and so on, and the other books of Moses, consistent with the Psalms and the Prophets and the New Testament. So the consistency between the different books is very important. So it's a good point. You want to look at that, and I'm happy to look at Matthew in particular, or any quotes you want to bring up.
I think we'll just keep it general, just keep it organic.
I'll use my phone, because I got all the references on there as well.
Okay, no problem. So I'll give you an example, just to establish what is that I was saying. If we just go to the New Testament, here's one, for example, that we spoke of.
Matthew 21.
Yeah, sure. Matthew 21. Where it mentions that Jesus comes to Jerusalem as a king. Now, fortunately, my footnote refers me back to Zechariah 9:9. Now, Matthew 21, verse 5 is saying, "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So it's mentioning Jesus riding on two donkeys.
No, on one donkey.
It mentions, okay.
It's like,
sure,
but fair enough. But it's one.
Sure, that's not the point I wanted to focus on too much. But if you go back to Zechariah 9, verse 9, it says, "The coming of Zion's king. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, verbatim, it differs. Thematically, the theme is there.
You mean Matthew is leaving a few things out of the quote?
No, it's word for word is getting it wrong. If we look at other verses in Matthew, it quotes the Old Testament correctly. However, in certain places, it misquotes the Old Testament. So if you go through all of the quotes, you will see some of them are quoted quite well.
Yeah.
But some of them are not.
In this case, the prophet Zechariah presents the idea that there were no kings in Israel at the time. All the kings had gone already. So Zechariah brings the idea that a king is coming, and he's coming riding on a donkey, which is very strange for a king to do.
Yes.
Okay. So he lives before Jesus, and he presents that a king is coming to Jerusalem on a donkey. Okay. Now Matthew says that is happening now. When Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, that prophecy is fulfilled. So that's basically Matthew is saying the prophecy of this prophet that we know happened a long time ago is fulfilled. Here is your king. So he's saying Jesus, who's coming on a donkey, is the king of Israel.
I agree with this. This is what I'm trying to say, that the textual preservation doesn't seem to be robust in terms of its wording. While in theme it may be there, if you keep on going through all of the quotations of the Old Testament, for example, Matthew, when he talks of Jesus at the temple, so that's Matthew 21, and then if you go to verse number 16, so Matthew has Jesus saying, "Have you never read?" And then it quotes the Old Testament, Psalms 8:2. He says, "From the lips of children and infants, your Lord have called forth your praise." However, when we go to Psalms 8:2, Psalms 8:2, it says, "Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger." Now, again, this is different from what we have in Matthew. It doesn't seem to be a robust preservation of the Old Testament, unless they had a different Old Testament scripture which they were reading from.
Yeah, he's quoting not literally, obviously, but
no, but he's saying, "Have you read?"
No, hold on. If you read Psalm 8, from the beginning, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babies and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. So here, this is glory and praise to God. It's coming out of the mouth of babies and infants. So although it's turned around, the meaning is understandably the
meaning
same,
is there, yes.
isn't it?
Yeah.
So it is, but that's how the Bible works. It's people speaking. Like in this case, it's David speaking. In this case, it's Matthew, but he's telling what Jesus said. And the meaning is clearly...
It's preserved, the meaning may be preserved.
It's clearly in accordance with each other. So.
But the wording is different, and this is where the issue is. As in, this is just one of the examples. If you look throughout the Bible, for example, it speaks, if you go to, for example, the reliability of...
And can I just, when you read about this, the mouth of infants and babies, you have prepared praise. What did the children sing when Jesus came in? The children were singing Hosanna to the Son of David. Now, you know the Son of David, what that means?
Explain.
Okay. God had promised David, because he was a man after God's heart. God promised David, after you, your son will sit on your throne forever. Okay? That's a promise to David. So David had a son called Solomon, who reigned for some time and died like everybody does. So the promise that his son would be on the throne forever wasn't fulfilled. So they were still expecting this son of David to come, the king of Israel, you see. So when the children said, the son of David is coming, Hosanna means praise be to God, you know, the son of the king is coming. Again, they were saying, the Messiah has come, this king of Israel has come. And so it is a very important point they're making. So it's good you picked that one up.
Yeah, so the point that I was making, first and foremost, is there's no preservation of text. The theme may be there, but text is extremely important, especially when you look at other things. For example, who were the eyewitnesses? You have Matthew, for example, documenting that in the beginning. In Matthew number 2, it talks about Jesus' childhood. It talks about the wise men visiting the Messiah. Now, it doesn't actually say who's eyewitnessing this, which is very interesting, because...
Jesus' childhood, for example, yeah?
For example, Jesus' childhood.
Do you know who Matthew was?
Yeah, he was a tax collector disciple.
Yeah, so Jesus called him while he was a tax collector.
Yeah. So what's happening? If I just build the point up, and then perhaps you can interact. He's saying that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and then somewhere from the east of Jerusalem, 3 wise men or magi came to visit him. If you read further why they came to visit him, they mentioned that they had seen a star when it rose. Now, this is very peculiar for wise men to just simply follow a star when we do deep reading. Wise men don't just follow stars to come to a cradle of a baby. It's very peculiar.
Well, hold on. You have
but then King Herod heard of this, and he got worried. And then he asked about the Messiah, and then the people told him that he would be born in Bethlehem in the land of Judea. Now, what happened now? These magi, they escaped, assuming that they would be under persecution from King Herod. And then what happened? Once they were gone, an angel of the Lord came to Joseph in the dream and said to him, "Get up, take the child, i.e. Jesus, and the mother, i.e. Mary, and escape to Egypt." And then what we have there, they escaped to Egypt until the death of Herod. Now, what's remarkable is that we don't have the source of this.
Okay.
We're being told about this story, and it's a fantastic story, but the question is, who is witnessing?
Okay.
If I'm getting this source from someone, then who am I getting this source from?
All right. Well, you can think it through like this. Matthew was a tax collector when Jesus was starting his ministry. We would think in general that Jesus was about 30 years old when he started to preach the good news. Okay. Matthew, being a tax collector, then at least he was an adult, so he might have been 20, 30, 40, something like that. So he was an adult as well. They were more or less the same age at the same time, in the same place. We do know that Jesus went to a wedding shortly after he started, where he turned water into wine, by the way. And his mother was there as well. So his disciples would have known his mother, you know, because they lived in the same area. And there is accounts in the Gospels that they met. So about the birth of Jesus, it is very likely that they would have spoken to Mary and said, well, what happened? Who is this man? You
But
know?
is there any evidence
No, but
of this?
it would be silly to assume that he wouldn't speak to the mother of Jesus while he was a good friend of Jesus. They were in the same area, in the same place. So if I'm a good friend of you and I come to visit your family and we go to parties together or we do things together,
So you're saying that Matthew
I will
spoke
find
to
out.
Mary? That Matthew spoke to Mary?
It would be strange if he hadn't. It would be really weird. So you would say,
So how come, just following on to this, because this may be a valid point, that maybe Matthew, the disciple, the tax collector, who was with Jesus, spoke to Mary to find out what happened about his youth.
yeah, obviously.
But then the problem is that it comes to a certain age where Jesus just goes missing from the age of 12. Because this is the last time we see him, at the age of 12, all the way, like you said, till he was 30 to 33 when he started his mission. So if we have such a magnificent, we know the boy or the young man is something to be of some kind of greatness for wise men to come to him. Where did this gap arise? As in, how come they all of a sudden lost him from radar? As in, could Mary or did Mary not fill in this gap? It's a good question, right?
Yeah. Now, the reason why Jesus came is to, the reason why Jesus came, he came as the Messiah. That's his purpose. There is a purpose in there. To save the people, to overcome the powers of death and darkness, etc. That's his mission. So that's why he came, and the Gospels are especially about that. That to establish he is the Messiah. That's the information they give. They're not there to talk about what he did in school or what he did when he was a kid or which color eyes he had or stuff. Lots of information like that would be interesting, but that's not the point. The point is he is the Messiah. And that point is made very clearly. That's what the Gospels are about. So like this, that he's born in Bethlehem, that's important because the Messiah was going to come out of Bethlehem, you know. That he went to Egypt is also important because God said, I have called my son out of Egypt already a long time before that. So it establishes clearly that he's the Messiah, but it doesn't give you sort of
It doesn't give the
picture,
details, but it's
no.
just peculiar how such a great person just disappears
Well,
off the map
I'm saying,
for approximately 18.
I'm saying because those details are not important. The importance of Jesus is that he's the Messiah. And
Okay,
that's
so
what the focus is of the whole
Perhaps
story.
if we just travel a bit further down his life, because even as he's an adult, we see that many a times it says that Jesus had spoken a gospel. Now we don't actually get, it's just about 3 or 4 occasions I can remember where it speaks about Jesus. If you want the quotes I can give them, speaks of a gospel. But we don't actually have the words of that gospel. Also at the end of John it says that Jesus had done many things that could not be recorded.
Otherwise the whole world would have been, couldn't contain the books.
Yes, but the problem is that we don't have much of Jesus from the age of 30 onwards. In fact,
No, because he died
collect,
3 years later.
That's right. So if you collect all of the words of Jesus, it only comes to a page, and most scholars dispute more than 3/4 of what he had said.
No, that's not true. They may dispute some, but not 3/4.
Don't want to get stuck on the details. I can provide you the details if you need the details. But there's scholars, reputable scholars, who say up to 3/4 of what he has said is misattributed to him.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that there's a lot of scholars who do think that Jesus said the things the Gospels say he says. So.
Okay, moving forward, and
I would agree with that as well. It is. I said before, it makes sense. What Jesus says in the Gospels makes sense in the bigger picture. It makes sense. It's consistent with what the Old Testament says.
There's a point I'm making right now.
It's consistent with the character of God. You know.
The point that I'm making now is
yeah.
about the quoting, the referencing, the sourcing, the eyewitnesses. So we spoke about the childhood, and then we went on to Jesus.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought
I'm just looking for the Gospel because you say we don't have clearly what the Gospel is.
Yeah, sure. Would you like me to show you?
But I think it is.
Yeah, sure. There's occasions where Jesus, where it says that Jesus, he speaks the gospel, but doesn't actually mention the gospel that he was speaking. For example, it says that he began to teach in the synagogue in Mark 5.
Yeah.
In Mark 5, but doesn't actually, oh sorry, Mark 6, but actually it doesn't actually tell us what the gospel was. There's other verses as well, if I could just bring that up. It's very cold today.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting cold, isn't it?
Welcome to London, bro.
Yeah, I know, it's freezing cold,
Hey,
man.
guys, come over there.
So yeah, it says in the gospel quite a few times actually, if I could just find it anyway.
Sorry, what are you looking for?
I'm showing you where Jesus he speaks of a gospel.
Yeah.
But then immediately after, it doesn't tell you what the gospel are. So
Okay,
I'm
look
showing
at-
you that there's large portions of information about Jesus' life that is missing. Particularly,
No, it's not. I don't think so.
huh?
Yeah, I don't think that's missing, but maybe it needs explaining a little bit.
Yeah, if I can find this, sure, it's really cold. It's missing as in it doesn't have the details. It speaks about Jesus
Okay.
preaching.
Go to Matthew 11.
So what is it that you're showing us?
About the gospel.
Are you sure Matthew 11?
Because we're in Matthew anyway, so that's a good place to start.
Matthew 11,
Matthew 11, verse 4.
verse 4, yes.
Okay, might as well start a little bit earlier, because then you get the picture. When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now when John, that's John the Baptist, heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, the Messiah, he sent word by his disciples, by his own disciples, and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" So he's asking Jesus, "Who are you?" You know, basically. And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up. And the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended to me." So the poor have good news preached to them.
Yes.
The gospel means
Yeah,
good news.
yeah.
So that's what Jesus said. The
The
good
point
news
is that
preached.
it doesn't give the details. This is the point I was trying to...
No, it does, because if you read before this, Matthew 6, 7 and 8, Jesus gives a speech we call the Beatitudes, where Jesus sets out
No, I agree, some
the good news
places-
of the kingdom.
Yeah, I'm saying in some places it does, but in many places it just skips over many things that he was saying.
See, this, Matthew 6, 7 and 8, is the main teaching of Jesus. 5 as well, starts at 5, I think, yeah. Matthew 5, if you start there, the Sermon on the Mount, that's where Jesus sets out what this kingdom is about. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now that's good news. You can understand that's good news, although it doesn't say this is good news. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so on, there is good news in all that.
No, I don't dispute that. What I'm saying is that there's large moments of Jesus' life which is completely gone. The details of his actions is not recorded. There's no witnesses, there is no testimonies. Example being, for example, when Jesus now gets to the ages of 30 to 33, it says that the disciples deserted and left him, but the story still continues.
Yeah.
So the question would be naturally, if everyone has deserted him,
Let's,
who is recording the story?
Let's look at where that happens.
Yeah, sure, we can go to Matthew 26.
Yeah.
Matthew 26. I've got here verse 56.
Yeah, it's in the Garden of Gethsemane. They leave him, yeah? Then all the disciples left him and fled.
So who then continues the story?
Okay. Now, if you go to 69,
69. Okay.
now it says, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. So, before, they left him and fled. Obviously, later they came back again.
Okay, so who wrote in
And-
that meantime?
And again, you see, he went to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, we know some of Jesus' friends were in the council, like Nicodemus. He was a friend of Jesus, but he was afraid of
Okay.
the Jews.
Okay.
He was there.
So
It wasn't-
you think that his source is Nicodemus?
his source can be Nicodemus or other people that were there.
But this is a...
Because this was not in secret. The high priest was there. There were the scribes and the elders.
Now this is very interesting, but what my point is, how come they're not referencing or sourcing their material when they're saying this, particularly when there are no eyewitnesses?
Because it doesn't need to be. There was one evening in the court of the high priest. It's a court where there are the scribes and the elders, and it's fairly public what's happening. It's not in secret. So people know and can find out who was there.
It's very important, reason being, this is one of the crucial parts in Jesus' life where he's about to be crucified in accordance to the Bible. If we're lacking eyewitnesses and we cannot source or reference, we're in some kind of...
No, we're not lacking them. Caiaphas was there, the scribes were there, the elders were there, and Peter was waiting outside, and
You
John
see,
was there
yeah,
outside.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So
yeah, sure.
it's not.
So
it's
let's
not
interact with
behind
that.
closed
Yeah.
doors. There
Let's
are
interact with that
eyewitnesses.
because it
Okay.
goes on in number 70, verse number 75. It says, Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken in verse number 75.
Yeah.
Before the cock crows, the crow,
The rooster crows.
you will disown me 3 times, and he went outside and wept bitterly. And the next time that we actually
So-
see Peter,
so
sorry, let me
Jesus-
just finish.
So Peter was there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and if it says he went outside.
Yeah.
So he wasn't there. So the next time he actually comes back is when we see in John.
Oh, that's
20.
another gospel. 'Cause
Let me finish the
yeah,
point.
okay,
Perhaps
go on.
you'll grasp what I'm saying. Is that's the last time he was there when he deceived Jesus thrice and then he went outside. And the next time he came back was after the empty tomb in John 20, verse number 3, where it says, so Peter and the other disciple started running towards the tomb. Yeah. So he wasn't present all of that time, which is a very integral point of time for Jesus. So again, the integrity of witnesses is at question.
No, because you know what happened wasn't behind closed doors. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. Okay. Then you read on. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus and put him to death. And they took him to Pilate, etc. So there are people there, and Matthew is writing an account based on what he heard from all those people.
So even though he's an eyewitness to many things, so you're saying that he's drawing from accounts of other people, which is fine, but the thing is, it's not references, and how do we know? Because we don't know this is Matthew, by the way.
Oh, we do.
No. You really believe it was Matthew?
Yeah.
Okay, do you believe in Mark and priority? Which was the first gospel?
Yeah, but that's...
Let's explore this because you believe...
Which was the first gospel?
Yeah.
No, that's a historic research that you would need to do.
I'm asking you, what do you think, from your research as a Christian,
Yeah.
which one is the first gospel? Well, usually
I don't know. I think the first gospel we have written is written by Paul, actually.
of the
sort of-
synoptics,
Yeah, but
Matthew,
also,
Mark,
hold on.
Luke and John, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, which one do you think is the first one?
Well, I think Matthew and Mark are fairly early. But
Okay, because you have what's called the synoptic problem.
what is the synoptic?
Synoptic problem is that when scholars look at Matthew, Mark and Luke side by side, they see similarities. They find for Mark, 80% of Mark is found in Matthew and Luke. Now they're assuming that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, which is very peculiar because Matthew is the tax collector disciple. Now why do we have the tax collector disciple copying from a non-eyewitness, Mark? If he is the author, it didn't make sense. At times we have word for word.
But it was,
If I just elaborate the point and I'll give it back to you, I promise.
You see, because they're assumptions that scholars make, but it could have been the other way around as well.
Yeah, the
So
scholars,
Mark could have copied from Matthew, or they could. It is very likely that they knew each other, because when Jesus died, Matthew didn't die, and Mark was already there.
isn't
Quite
this
likely.
another assumption?
So it is very likely that Matthew and Mark knew each other, and after Jesus rose again, they thought, what happened here? You know, they had to make sense of it. Who is this guy? Who was this guy? Who is Jesus? How can he be the Messiah? How can he rise from the dead? So it was a small community, maybe 120 people. It would be outrageous if they didn't talk to each other. We know they met daily in the temple. They would meet every day. They would eat together. So they would have spoken to each
let's
other.
say, for example,
so that
Chris,
Mark and Matthew...
let's say I was an eyewitness.
Yeah, but that they all...
Why would I be copying from a non-eyewitness?
No, because we know that they met every day. They ate together. They were in the same place. So it would be outrageous if they had a totally different story.
No, I don't find that persuasive. I'll give you the reasons why, if you allow me.
If we come together every day for a number of years, it is very likely that we talk to each other, and we even they ate together every day. Okay, so the information they had was shared, and it's likely that also Mary was there, and Nicodemus was there, and Peter, and so on. So that it's similar is only.
You see,
to
the
be expected.
datings are different. Scholars usually give the dating for Mark to be sometimes as early as 40. The dating for Luke, they give up to 95. For John, 120, or sorry, 80, but the earliest manuscript is about 120, P52 they say. The point is that if I, as an eyewitness, am writing, why am I writing and copying almost word for word at times from a non-eyewitness?
Because, no, you say Mark is a non-eyewitness. Mark wasn't one of the 12, but
that's the point I'm making.
He wasn't. No,
that's
he
the
wasn't.
point I'm making.
He wasn't one of the 12, but there was also a 70 that Jesus sent out. Okay.
So you're saying now he got it from these 70? Is that what you're now postulating?
No, I'm saying, you say Mark wasn't an eyewitness because he wasn't one of the 12. I say he could be one of the 70, or there were even more people that knew Jesus. The 120 that were together at Pentecost, the 3,000 that joined the day after, and the 5,000 that joined a little bit later, they were all in the same place and they ate together, they met each other regularly. So the sharing of information that you find in the different Gospels is only to be expected.
You know, the scholars generally don't tend to say this. They say that the synoptic gospel, so the synoptic problem arose because, one, they assume Mark in priority because of these similarities. That is, Mark was the first writer. Thereafter, you see similarities found in Matthew and Luke, and that's why they're called synoptics, because they're seen as sisters. If you just bear with me 1 second. So 40% of Luke and 40% of Matthew is taken from 80% of Mark. Okay. Yeah, and such a large chunk is taken off Mark. That's why they believe Mark was the first writer. Now, there's also another 20% which is unaccounted for, a similarity between Matthew and Luke. Now, this 20% also gives them the conclusion of another source document which they may assume to be oral. It's called the Q document. It's a hypothetical document. Some say it's an oral tradition. But then the problem again lies, if 20% of Matthew and Luke is taken from Q, which is a hypothetical document, how do we examine this document to check if it's, to be rigorous in our checking, to check its authenticity, to check how good they were at fact-checking or history writing? Well, and Mark also...
but within 10, 20 years, 30 years maybe after Jesus died, the Gospels were written or were in a sort of form available. So it is likely that those people knew each other and that they have a similar... But the point why you should be a Christian is basically because all these Gospels tell you that Jesus, the King of the Jews, the Messiah, had victory over everything. Like he had the authority over illnesses, over demons. He raised people from the dead. He brought a teaching that really showed the heart of God. And above everything else, while the authorities killed him, he rose from the dead. So he also has authority over the power of death. Now nobody else has that. So Jesus is the Messiah, and Messiah, if you translate it into Greek, means Christ. That's why you should be a Christian.
The only problem is when you talk about doctrine, it gets affected when the text is affected. For example, you spoke about the resurrection. Here we have the ending of Mark, which we know now to be a false addition that came afterwards.
A false addition, it's a later addition. but not false.
As in another author had written it, so it's not really Mark's writing. So that's what I mean by false edition, because it's called, sorry, anyway, I'll leave the details. It mentions here some manuscripts, they don't have the verses from 9 to 20. Now this talks about the doctrine of resurrection, commission, baptism, eternal damnation, and the ascension. Now if Mark,
Yeah.
yeah, sure. Now if Mark, for example, it says go into the world and preach. You know, this is the commission. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. This is talking about the baptism and so on. So all of these doctrinal issues are found there in these verses, which we know to be a later addition. Matthew and Luke, later writers, who are copying from Mark.
Yeah, but you see, if you leave
Mark,
if you say
as Mark stops, he stops. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Mark stops at the empty tomb. He does not go further. But Christians later seem to have added this in to give some kind of justification.
But you realize
to the doctrine of resurrection.
You realize when Mark was writing his gospel, he didn't write it in a book or in a book like this, because books like this didn't exist. He wrote it on a scroll.
He wrote on a scroll, okay.
That's what they did.
Okay.
Now, a scroll gets damaged at the beginning or the end.
That's right. That's
okay.
Right, yeah.
So it's possible that the end of that scroll was damaged.
Okay.
And later repaired or something like that. Or it just disappeared and they put something else on.
This is the problem that I'm having, is in.
But Mark,
if everything is upon a supposition and conjecture.
In Mark, Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection 3 times. So it is not strange that the resurrection is in Mark, because that's what Jesus already predicted somewhere in Mark itself. You see?
Some of the scholars on this talk about retrospective prophecies, as in these were read into and then the text was later changed. And this is why text integrity matters so much.
So we can go back.
So you go back and then you reconstruct it to make it look like a prophecy fulfillment. But I don't want to get stuck.
So I'm saying
too much
the idea of the resurrection is part of the whole story of Mark. And it's part of the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. And because all this connects, you should become a Christian.
The thing is, even like for example, you mentioned this edition, the concepts in the doctrines, the Trinity, the Son of God, it seems, for example, 1 John 5:7, this was a later edition. You know, the Comma Johannium, like it first appeared in Erasmus's copy.
John 5:7.
Yeah, in the majority text. So for there are three that
you
bear
talk about the Gospel of John.
Yeah, 1 John 5:7. Yeah?
Or the Epistle of John or the Gospel of John?
Yeah, I'll just pull it out for you. Oof. So it says for the first John. So it says the epistle. It says for there are there are 3 that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Ghost.
So you're talking about the Trinity now, really?
No, this is what I'm saying. Is in these
but
we know.
I haven't talked about the Trinity yet, because that's a different subject. I've said you should be a Christian because Jesus is the Messiah.
Okay, because Jesus is the Messiah.
If you understand the Trinity or not, doesn't really matter yet.
Oh, okay.
Jesus is the Messiah.
I believe him as Messiah.
See?
Yes.
There you go.
Does that mean I'm Christian?
Well, you.
No, I'm telling you,
exactly.
you should believe in him as the Messiah.
Good. Now, do we understand what that means, Messiah? I've said Jesus, the king, the son of David. I've talked about the king of the Jews that is coming. I've talked about the victory over death that Jesus had. So I've said about the authority that he has about illnesses and demons and all. Now that's the Messiah.
But this is what I'm saying, all of this stuff that you're talking about, the doctrinal issues, a lot of them, a large portion of them aren't there in the original text.
So you get stuck in this hole of your understanding of the Trinity, which is very strange kind of understanding it. Actually, that Jesus is the Messiah should inspire you to become a Christian, or to at least start taking him really serious.
Or inspire us to become Muslim, because what we understand, if we elaborate on what we are saying, is that throughout Jewish history or all the prophets' history, we see again and again the concept of monotheism.
No, because
if I elaborate, because you had the chance. So we see this concept of monotheism in all of the prophets again and again and again. In the Old Testament, the Jews understood it again as the concept of one God. one God.
God is one.
Huh?
God is one.
God is one. Even
Yeah.
in the Ten Commandments, God is one. There's no such thing as a Trinity.
Jesus said
What
it
we
as well.
see also, what we see if you look at history, when Paul goes over to Rome, it becomes like a Hellenization of early Jewish law. So Jews' laws for the Gentiles didn't exist. Why? Because they were simply trying to invite pagans. Also, at the times that they were living there in Rome, they had concepts such as Trinity. The Trinity existed for the Roman gods. So then what we saw...
But you're digressing again.
No,
You're
if you
going
allow
down
me
the-
to elaborate,
You're going in the same hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One second.
Try to stick to the point that Jesus is the Messiah and what that means for
I
you.
agree. Yeah, sure. This is what
Yeah.
I'm saying. For the Messiah is someone who came, Allah, we say God had sent down the Messiah for you and I so that we may worship only God. And that no Trinity, no men, no ghosts, no trees, no sticks, no stones. Just as Abraham had done so, Isaac and Ismail had done so. We believe in a continuation of prophets giving the message of one God. And this is where I, Chris, invite you towards worshiping only one God. No men, no spirits, no stones.
Yeah, but that's a misconception, that I would worship more than one God. That is complete nonsense. There's no Christian who actually has more than one God.
Well, Marcion did actually. If you look at
Well,
early church
yeah,
history,
but
there was many
but
concepts
it
of
is clear.
what God was. The development of Trinity
no.
came many years later.
The formulation of the Trinity was
Came-
300 years later.
Yes.
Okay, something like that. But that is to explain that is to explain the Bible, and it takes a bit of time to actually go through what exactly that formulation means.
Taken from the Bible.
Various scripts, to combine various scripts. But the point is, when Jesus is the Messiah, he is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He's God's promise. He's God's provision, and we do not need somebody else to do that. So when Jesus is the King of the Jews, he also becomes the King of us. He's the final authority. He was given all authority in heaven and on earth. So what I do, I have to think, what would Jesus do? Or how would Jesus see this? He has been given all authority. So there is no other authority that I need than his in these matters.
But if you don't know what he had said,
But we do
and
know
the
what he
Bible
said.
doesn't capture accurately what he had said,
And
we don't know the sources, which goes back to the original point that I was saying.
You can check it.
No, we did check it. We saw.
What about? What do you want to know about?
Yeah,
we'll
sure.
check if what he said about.
Yeah, sure. For example, we mentioned that there were issues of reliability in terms of the gospel, who was copying who and why witnesses copying from non-witnesses.
For me,
we
that's
also
not
spoke
an issue
about
because they were together, so they talk to each other.
Yeah, and then you had also variations. For example, in the additions rather, the end of Mark was missing completely, and
Yeah,
it ends up giving you much more theology on your plate than you had previously.
You
which
can leave
then,
that out, and you
but
can
then
leave
when
that
you
bit
look
out, and
at
nothing
Chris,
changes.
when you look at a real historical perspective, understanding that Paul went to proselytize to the Gentiles, to a religion which is similar to that religion that they had, and they already had concepts such as the Son of God. In fact, their leaders were called Lord God.
On the Roman coins, you
My
had the
Lord, my God.
inscription. On the Roman coins, you had the inscription like Caesar Augustus, Son of God. He was when Jesus being the Messiah, being the Son of God, stands opposed to the Roman Empire, of course.
This is the point that you're actually making
Because
for me,
they call
that these
Jesus-
terms, even logos, for example, this is not just a word, this is a theological understanding which was borrowed from paganism, which existed in Rome. Son of God also was, for many of the leaders there, was a term that was used for them. Also, my Lord, my God, which is an exclamation you may be familiar with from John, is also found to be associated with some of the Roman leaders. And at the same time that this was used is the same time when it first appeared in Christianity. So with Christianity, what we saw, like we see today, for example, when Christmas comes, we bring the tree out, which was a Celtic tradition.
Some people do.
Yes, some people do. The decoration of the trees, the carol singing. what Christianity had done in Europe was take on the Druids and the Celts tradition. Likewise, at that time, Christianity had taken on the tradition.
You're mixing all sorts of things up. I think the point is that they said Jesus has authority. You can call him Lord, you know, like when they say my Lord. That's a title that they would use for other authorities. Basically, they're saying actually Jesus has all authority. These Roman Caesars can think what they want, but Jesus has all authority.
I think did you follow through the point that I was making, that it's almost a replica?
They said it's not a replica. That is fake. They said that what the Romans are doing
exists before.
What the Romans are doing is fake. They say all authority, but actually Jesus has all authority. And I would say similarly, when you do your religious study, you look at what the Quran says. I said, well, you shouldn't. Jesus has all authority. He is the prophet that was promised. He is God's provision. You don't need the Quran and you don't need the teaching of Muhammad. It's all fine, but you don't need it because Jesus has all authority, because he's the Messiah. He's the God's provision that was promised.
Help me to unpack that. What does that actually mean? It sounds good that you worded away these issues, but what does that actually mean? As in put away the Quran and this, because Jesus is an authority. What does that actually mean in English?
That means in English that he's the boss, he's the king,
so
he's
what does that
the
mean
authority.
For me?
What I do with my life, I think...
But I say he's a Messiah and then I'm saved?
No, just...
So what does that actually mean?
It means what you're going to do with your life, what's the purpose of your life, what are you going to do with your skills and your talents and the time that you've had.
Chris, let's go to the source in Jesus. Who did he worship, Chris? And would you not like to worship who Jesus worshipped? Exactly. In your heart of hearts, because where is in the Quran, if you allow me just to elaborate, you will stand before your Lord one day, and I know you are a sincere guy. The question is, will you have the strength on that day when God asks you, who did you worship? Would you really, really have the strength, Chris, to say that I worship men and spirits aside of the one God whom you may refer to?
Who do I worship?
My plea to you anyway
it is clear
is that you come
it is clear.
towards the worship of God.
It is clear God is one, and that's the one I worship. Nobody else is worthy of
They're
worship.
on the same plane.
Isn't
But
it?
I know I don't want to extend this conversation too long. It's been really pleasurable. I do enjoy that. Thank you very much, Chris.
All right.
يا لغتي عربي